Berlin, October 1944. The folder landed on the polished wood with a sound that seemed too soft for what it contained. Heinrich Himmler stood near the window of Hitler's study in the Reich Chancellery, watching the Führer's hands as they opened the intelligence report. Outside, the afternoon light filtered through clouds heavy with the promise of rain, casting the room in shades of gray that matched the mood of every briefing these days. Hitler's fingers traced the photograph, clipped to the first page. A massive aircraft, photographed from below by some agent, or intercepted from American sources, its wings stretching wider than anything Germany had managed to build. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress. Even the name carried a kind of industrial arrogance that made his jaw tighten. "This cannot be accurate," Hitler said, his voice flat. Not a question. A refusal. His finger tapped the specifications listed beneath the photograph. These numbers, they're propaganda, American exaggeration. Himmler shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking in the silence. "The intelligence has been verified through multiple sources, my Führer. Swiss contacts, intercepted communications, reports from our agents in Sweden. The aircraft is real. The capabilities appear to be genuine." Hitler looked up from the folder, his eyes carrying that particular intensity that had once commanded rooms full of generals, but now, increasingly, seemed to burn against a reality that refused to bend. A bomber that can fly 5,000 kilometers, carry 9,000 kilograms of bombs, at 11,000 meters altitude, in a pressurized cabin. He read the words like an accusation. While our pilots freeze in unpressurized cockpits, the Americans sit in shirt sleeves. The silence stretched. Himmler knew better than to fill it. "And these," Hitler continued, his finger stabbing at another line, "remote-controlled gun turrets. 12 machine guns, operated from inside the aircraft." His voice rose slightly. "We are still mounting manual gun positions on the He-177 while they have created a flying fortress that shoots back automatically." What Hitler said in that moment, according to Himmler's later testimony, and the accounts of others present during similar briefings, revealed something deeper than tactical concern. It exposed the widening gap between the Führer's understanding of modern industrial warfare and the reality unfolding across 3 continents. "The Americans," Hitler said, setting the folder down with deliberate care, "have built a bomber that makes everything we have achieved look like children's toys. This is not possible in the time they claim. There must be an explanation." But there was an explanation. It just wasn't one Hitler wanted to hear. 3 years earlier, in September 1942, the first B-29 had lifted off from Boeing's factory airfield in Seattle. The aircraft had been born from a specification the U.S. Army Air Corps had issued in 1940, before America had even entered the war. They wanted a bomber that could carry a ton of bombs for 8,000 kilometers, a hemisphere-spanning weapon that could strike anywhere and return home. Boeing's engineers had delivered something that redefined what a bomber could be. The B-29 wasn't just bigger than previous aircraft. It represented a fundamental leap in aviation technology, the kind of engineering achievement that required not just brilliant design, but an industrial base capable of manufacturing precision at scale. The pressurized cabin alone required innovations in sealing and air circulation that German engineers were still trying to solve. The remote gun turrets used a central fire control system that calculated bullet trajectories based on airspeed, altitude, and target movement, then automatically aimed the guns. It was closer to what would later be called aerospace engineering than traditional aircraft design. The wingspan stretched 141 feet. The length ran 99 feet from nose to tail. 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, each producing over 2,000 horsepower, drove propellers 13 feet across. Empty, the aircraft weighed 74,000 pounds. Fully loaded for a long-range mission, it could weigh 140,000 pounds and still climb to 33,000 feet. Hitler had spent the morning of that October day reviewing reports from the Western Front, where American and British forces were grinding through France toward Germany's borders. The strategic bombing campaign that had begun as pinprick raids in 1942 had grown into a systematic dismantling of German industrial capacity. Cities that had once hummed with war production now smoldered. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, operated at a fraction of its capacity. Oil refineries burned. Ball-bearing factories lay in ruins. Transportation networks fractured under repeated strikes. And now, this. An aircraft that made the B-29 Flying Fortress look modest. A bomber that could fly higher, faster, farther, and carry more destruction than anything in the Luftwaffe's arsenal or imagination. "Where are they deploying it?" Hitler asked, his voice quieter now, controlled. "The Pacific Theater, my Führer, against Japan, from bases in China and the Mariana Islands. The reports indicate they are conducting raids on the Japanese home islands from distances we considered impossible." Hitler's face remained still, but something shifted behind his eyes. "A calculation, a recognition. They are not using it against us." "Not yet. The assessment suggests they don't need to. The B-17 and B-24 are sufficient for the European theater. The B-29 is reserved for the Pacific, where the distances are greater." This, perhaps more than the aircraft's capabilities, seemed to strike deepest. The Americans had built a superweapon and didn't even need to use it against Germany. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Germany wasn't worth the deployment of America's best bomber. The existing aircraft were doing the job just fine. Hitler stood, walking to the window where Himmler had been standing. Below, Berlin continued its daily routine, but the city bore scars now. Rubble piles marked where buildings had stood. Anti-aircraft batteries dotted the skyline. The population had learned to read the air raid sirens the way farmers once read weather signs. "How many have they built?" he asked. "The exact number is unclear. Estimates suggest production of several hundred per month. By war's end, possibly several thousand." Several hundred per month. Hitler's mind, which had once grasped the details of every German division and weapon system, struggled with the scale. Germany's entire bomber production for 1944 would barely reach 3,000 aircraft of all types. The Americans were building hundreds of just this one model every month, while simultaneously producing fighters, transports, and maintaining the massive B-17 and B-24 production lines. "And our America bomber?" Hitler asked, referring to the long-range bomber project that had consumed resources and engineering talent for years. The Messerschmitt Me-264, designed to strike New York from bases in France, remained a prototype, a dream on paper and in wind tunnels, while the Americans flew actual aircraft on actual missions across actual oceans. Himmler's silence answered the question. The Führer turned from the window, and what he said next revealed the depth of his miscalculation about America. "I was told their industrial capacity was overrated, that their society was too soft, too divided, too corrupted by democracy and Jews to sustain a real war effort. I was told they could not match German engineering and discipline." He walked back to his desk, picking up the folder again, staring at the photograph of the B-29 as if intensity of gaze could unmake it. "This aircraft proves we were told lies, or we believed what we wanted to believe." The B-29's development had cost $3 billion, making it the most expensive weapons program of the war, surpassing even the Manhattan Project in its early stages. The Americans had built factories to build the factories that built the bomber. New plants in Wichita, Renton, Marietta, and Omaha, each employing tens of thousands of workers. The production system itself was an innovation, with sub-assemblies manufactured across the country and shipped to final assembly plants that operated like clockwork. Boeing had essentially invented modern aerospace manufacturing to build this aircraft. Wind tunnels tested every surface. Pressurization systems underwent thousands of hours of trials. The fire control computers represented cutting-edge analog computing. Every rivet, every seal, every wire had to meet specifications tighter than anything in previous aviation history, because the B-29 operated at altitudes and speeds where small failures became catastrophic. Hitler's Germany, by contrast, had scattered its aviation industry across dozens of manufacturers, each protecting their own designs and patents. Coordination breaking down under the weight of bureaucratic infighting and Hitler's own tendency to interfere in technical decisions. The Heinkel He-177, Germany's primary strategic bomber, suffered from chronic engine problems and never achieved its promised performance. The Junkers Ju-88, versatile and reliable, couldn't match Allied bombers for range or payload. The Focke-Wulf-Tafel 100, potentially revolutionary, remained in limited production due to resource constraints and competing priorities. What did Göring say when he saw this report? Hitler asked. Himmler's expression flickered. The Reichsmarshal suggested the specifications might be inflated for propaganda purposes. Of course he did. Hitler's voice carried contempt. Hermann Göring, once the swaggering head of the Luftwaffe, who had promised no enemy bomber would reach Berlin, had become an increasingly irrelevant figure, his morphine addiction and detachment from reality growing as his air force shrank. Göring has been wrong about every aspect of the air war. He promised the Luftwaffe would stop the Allied bombing. He promised our fighters would sweep them from the sky. He promised jet fighters would restore air superiority. Now he promises these specifications are propaganda. Hitler sat down heavily, the folder still open before him. The B-29 stared up from the photograph, its sleek profile and massive scale undeniable. Do you know what this aircraft represents, Himmler? It represents everything we failed to understand about this war. We thought superior will would overcome superior resources. We thought tactical brilliance would defeat strategic depth. We thought a nation of warriors would triumph over a nation of shopkeepers. He tapped the photograph again. But the shopkeepers built this. While we were perfecting the Panzer tank and the 88mm gun, they were building an industrial system that can produce aircraft like this by the hundreds. While we were conquering territory, they were conquering production problems. While we were winning battles, they were winning the war of factories and furnaces. The admission hung in the air, stark and bitter. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, spattering against the window glass. The reports from our agents in America, Himmler said carefully, describe factory complexes that stretch for kilometers, assembly lines that never stop, workers in 3 shifts around the clock. They have turned entire cities into weapons production centers. Detroit alone produces more vehicles than all of Germany. Hitler's hand clenched into a fist on the desk. I know the reports. I've read them. I've seen the numbers. And I've watched as our own production struggles with labor shortages, material shortages, transportation breakdowns, and Allied bombing. We are being outproduced by a factor of 10 to 1, perhaps 20 to 1. The exact number doesn't matter anymore. The trend is what matters. The B-29 had entered combat in June 1944 with a raid on Bangkok from bases in India. The distances involved were staggering. Round-trip missions of over 4,000 kilometers, crossing the Himalayas, the highest mountains in the world. The Americans called it flying the hump, and they did it routinely. In aircraft that could maintain cabin pressure and temperature, while outside the temperature dropped to 60 degrees below zero. By late 1944, B-29s were flying from the Mariana Islands against Japan itself. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam had become massive air bases, each hosting hundreds of the giant bombers. The raids on Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and other Japanese cities were conducted at altitudes where Japanese fighters struggled to reach and where anti-aircraft fire thinned to ineffectiveness. The Americans were systematically burning Japanese cities to ash and there was almost nothing Japan could do to stop it. Hitler understood, in that October afternoon, that if the Americans chose to deploy the B-29 against Germany, the result would be similar. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin defending against existing Allied raids, would face an aircraft that flew higher and faster than most German fighters could effectively intercept. The pressurized cabin meant crews could fight at full efficiency at altitudes where German pilots gasped for oxygen. The remote gun turrets meant attacking fighters faced concentrated, computer-aimed fire from multiple directions. "What is the operational ceiling?" Hitler asked, though he'd already read the specification. 11,500 meters, my Führer. Higher in optimal conditions. Hitler nodded slowly. The Focke-Wulf W-190, one of Germany's best fighters, struggled above 10,000 meters. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 could reach higher, but its performance degraded significantly. The new jet fighters, the Me-262, could catch the B-29, but jet production numbered in the dozens per month, not hundreds, and jets consumed fuel at rates Germany's dwindling petroleum supplies could barely sustain. "I want to know," Hitler said, his voice taking on the edge that preceded decisions, "why we could not build something like this. I want a full report on what prevented German industry from matching this achievement. Not excuses, not blame. Analysis. What did they do that we could not do?" Himmler nodded, though both men knew the answer wouldn't change anything. The reasons were systemic and deep. Germany's industrial base, while advanced, was smaller than America's. The Allied bombing campaign had disrupted production networks. Resource shortages, particularly in strategic materials like aluminum and high-grade steel, limited what could be built. The Nazi system's inefficiencies, with multiple agencies competing for resources and Hitler's own interference in technical matters, had prevented the kind of focused, sustained development effort that produced the B-29. But beyond those practical factors lay something more fundamental. America's industrial culture emphasized standardization, mass production, and continuous improvement. Henry Ford's assembly line principles had spread throughout American manufacturing. The country had spent decades perfecting the art of making things in quantity without sacrificing quality. Germany's industrial tradition emphasized craftsmanship and precision, but often at the expense of production volume. German tanks were often superior in individual combat to American tanks, but America produced 5 Shermans for every Panther Germany built. The B-29 embodied this difference. It was an engineering marvel, but it was also a production miracle. Boeing had designed it for mass manufacture. Parts were standardized, assembly processes were optimized, workers were trained systematically. The entire system was designed to build not one perfect bomber, but thousands of very good bombers, quickly and reliably. Hitler stood again, pacing now, the energy that had once driven him to dominate Europe, seeking an outlet in the confined space of his study. "They will use this against us eventually," he said. "If the war continues, they will bring these aircraft to Europe. They will fly from England or France, and they will strike our cities with impunity. Our fighters won't stop them. Our anti-aircraft guns won't reach them. Our people will watch them pass overhead like gods, untouchable." The image seemed to crystallize something in his mind. The Führer, who had promised to make Germany invincible, who had sworn no enemy would violate German airspace with impunity, faced the reality of an enemy weapon he couldn't counter. "This is what defeat looks like," he said quietly. "Not losing a battle, not retreating from a city. This, an enemy aircraft we cannot match, cannot stop, cannot even adequately defend against. An aircraft that represents an industrial and technological superiority so complete that our best efforts seem medieval by comparison." Himmler remained silent. What could be said? The assessment was accurate. Hitler returned to his desk one more time, closing the folder with the B-29 photograph. "We will continue fighting," he said, his voice firmer now. the momentary vulnerability buried under will. We will develop new weapons, the V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, new tanks. We will make them pay for every kilometer of German soil. But I am not blind, Himmler. I see what this aircraft means. I see what it represents. He looked up, meeting the Reichsfuhrer's eyes. The Americans have won the war of production. They won it before we even realized it was the decisive battlefield. They won it in their factories in Detroit and Seattle and everywhere else. They won it with their engineers and their workers, and their system that can turn resources into weapons faster than we can destroy them. This bomber is just the proof. The rain fell harder now, drumming against the windows, and in that sound, Hitler heard the approach of something inevitable. Not just the Allied armies closing from east and west, but the weight of industrial reality crushing the dreams of empire he'd built on will and violence. The B-29 Superfortress, flying somewhere over the Pacific at that very moment, represented a future where Germany's place was not as conqueror, but as conquered, not as master race, but as defeated nation. What Hitler said when he first encountered the B-29, according to the fragments of testimony and documentation that survived, was essentially this. He recognized that Germany had lost the war of technology and production, that American industrial might had created weapons Germany couldn't match, and that all the will and ideology in the world couldn't overcome the simple mathematics of production capacity. He said it with anger, with bitterness, with a kind of stunned recognition that the worldview he'd built his movement upon had missed something fundamental about modern warfare. The B-29 would never bomb Berlin. The war in Europe ended before the aircraft deployed there. But its existence, its capabilities, and what it represented about American power had already achieved a kind of victory. It had forced Hitler to confront a truth he'd spent years denying, that the nation he'd dismissed as weak and decadent had proven stronger where it mattered most. In the final months of the war, as Germany collapsed, Hitler would occasionally reference the B-29 in his increasingly detached rants about wonder weapons and final victories. But that October afternoon in 1944, when he first saw the intelligence report and photograph, his reaction had been clearer and more honest. He'd recognized the bomber for what it was, proof that Germany had lost the race that mattered most. Not the race for territory or tactical victories, but the race for industrial and technological supremacy that would determine the war's outcome. The folder with the B-29 photograph remained in Hitler's study, buried eventually under other reports, other intelligence assessments, other evidence of gathering defeat. But the aircraft it documented continued its missions, flying higher and farther than German engineering had managed, dropping more bombs than German industry could replace, operated by crews who sat in pressurized comfort while German pilots froze in open cockpits. The shopkeepers had indeed built something remarkable, and the warrior nation had no answer for it except the bitter recognition that will alone could not overcome industrial reality. That recognition, more than any single battle or campaign, marked the moment when Hitler understood the war was truly lost. The B-29 had delivered its most devastating payload without ever flying over Germany, the psychological bomb of undeniable American superiority in the realm that ultimately decided modern wars. Not courage or ideology or racial theories, but the ability to build more, build better, and build faster than the enemy could destroy. The Superfortress had lived up to its name, not through any single mission, but by embodying a level of technological and industrial achievement that Germany, for all its vaunted engineering prowess, could not match. And Hitler, staring at that photograph on a rainy October afternoon, had said as much. In his own way, with his own bitter recognition of what it meant, he had acknowledged that the Americans had built something Germany could not, and that this fact alone spoke volumes about who would ultimately win the war. The rest was just time and blood, the working out of an equation that the B-29 had made undeniable.